This is a photograph of the outside of our house. We found when we moved here that we were living on the site of what was once the Redhill General Hospital, and before that the workhouse. One of our members was for a short time working for an estate agent, and she was showing a house to a couple who were very interested in it until they discovered that it was on the site of the hospital mortuary. They immediately withdrew. Bad feng shui, apparently. We are told that our house is on the site of the maternity ward. I don't know that feng shui has anything to do with it, but we have been very happy here. This is a way of introducing our presentation this afternoon, which is the history of the development of the hospital services in this area, written largely by Darwent with contributions from some of our members. In these unprecedented pandemic times, we have become increasingly aware of the role of the National Health Service and its hospitals in providing the vital care and protection of the nation's health. In the borough of Reigate and Banstead, this is essentially through East Surrey Hospital, and this is the story of how its development came about and how our local increasing population growth in the 19th and 20th centuries created the local and social medical needs and how they were resolved. Earlier than the 1800s, little medical aid had been offered to the local poor and infirm until in 1794 the parishes of Reigate, Nutfield and Headley formed a poor law union, meaning a joining together, not a trade union as today, and built a workhouse on what became known as Union Road, St John's, with accommodation and care for the sick, aged and destitute poor of the area. Nursing care was increasingly needed, and by 1910 a union infirmary had replaced the workhouse on the renamed Pendleton Road. Earlier, as with most rural communities, Reigate was remote from the hospital facilities of a large city, resulting in high mortality rates and the need for great changes in medical care. In 1859, at Cranley, Dr. Albert Napper had founded the country's first cottage hospital, a simple, converted cottage with space for beds and operations. It was an immediate success, and in 1860 a public meeting advocated that a similar hospital should be built in Reigate. No progress was made until 1864, when Dr. John Walters came to Reigate. Born in Ewell and qualified in medicine and surgery, he joined an established medical practice and occupied 16 Bell Street as his surgery and family home, later moving to a larger house at 3 Church Street. Today, the ground floor is partly occupied by Café Rouge, whilst its original upper story remains.
A competent GP, Dr. Walters needed hospital where he could develop his surgical skills and soon became involved with the plans for a Reigate Cottage Hospital. Subscriptions were attained from prosperous local residents, and a pair of cottages in Albert Road North were converted to provide 6 beds. We have no pictures, but the site is now occupied by 2 houses, which possibly are the restored original cottages. So in 1866, Reigate Cottage Hospital, the second in Britain, was opened, beginning the long road towards our present-day East Surrey Hospital. With growing patient demands, in 1871, it changed its name to the Reigate and Redhill Cottage Hospital and moved to White Post Hill, where initially 12 patients were accommodated. All types of condition were admitted, as at that time there was scant knowledge of bacterial infection. Admissions steadily grew, And whilst the doctors worked voluntarily, more financial support was needed. In 1880, the Reigate and Redhill Hospital Fund was created to raise more money, and with the proceeds donated to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, allowed in 1887 an east wing with surgeon's theatre and a maternity ward to be built. Dr. Waters performed most of the major operations at the steadily extending hospital until 1899, when his son, Dr. Alexander Ratcliffe Waters, a qualified doctor, but above all, a competent organiser, joined the hospital staff and played a major part in its future development. In 1907, the word cottage was dropped, and in 1923 finally changed its name to East Surrey Hospital. Dr. John Waters died in 1917.
After the end of World War II, a scheme was launched to build a new memorial hospital on Ray Common, but the fund failed to raise sufficient capital and was closed in 1922. The well-established East Surrey Hospital continued, many of its patients now the result of road accidents. In 1930, the infirmary on Pendleton Road came under Surrey County Council control, and by 1936, new buildings were erected and renamed the Redhill General Hospital. Everything changed with World War II. In 1939, the government had commissioned the building of a hospital in Smallfield with 200 beds for the care of the many expected London bombing casualties. In 1941, it was taken over by the Army and renamed the Queen Alexandra Hospital. In December 1942, although deeply involved in waging the dreadful war, Parliament also debated post-war social welfare, following a report by Sir William Beveridge, a highly regarded liberal economist, giving a summary of the principles necessary to abolish want, including free healthcare for all. The coalition cabinet initially decided not to commit itself to action, but pressure from Parliament forced Prime Minister Churchill to produce plans for future legislation. Post-war, in 1946, the Labour government passed the National Health Service Act, and most hospitals passed to the National Health Service, including the original East Surrey Hospital in White Post Hill. There, by 1975, expansion had reached its limit, and patients and services were gradually transferred to Redhill General Hospital. This soon also proved inadequate for the demands, and in 1949 it was merged with Smallfield Hospital. At this point, this history begins to be personal. Members of our U3A worked and gave birth in Redhill General Hospital. And here are some of their stories.
My mother's maiden name was Agnes Victoria Wells, SRN SEM DN London, the first matron of Redhill General Hospital, which became East Surrey Hospital. When I moved to Reigate in the mid-80s, I was aware of my mother's past connection with the hospital, but never went inside to explore the old building before it was demolished. I believe the hospital was founded in 1936, and I think my mother was the first matron. She had trained in Guy's Hospital and worked there as a theatre sister, ward sister, and admin sister. She held the post of matron in Redhill up to her marriage in March 1938. I know she was there in 1937. She told me that her fiancé, my father, and friends would motor down from London to take Sunday afternoon tea in her matron's flat. sadly, I've been unable to find any photos of her in those days. Evidence of my mother working in the old East Surrey Hospital or Redhill General is in the inscription of a brass plaque, which is on the East Surrey Hospital's website, Exploring Surrey's Past, where you can see photos of a few memorial plaques. The first one on the right gives her name and the date, 1937, and was in memory of her elder brother, Leonard Frank Wells, MC, killed in 1918. The inscription reads, presented by his sister, Agnes V. Wells, matron of the East Surrey Hospital, 1937. My mother spoke of him often, but was never able to visit his grave.
Next, we have something from our oldest contributor, Joan Brown. She started her nursing career as a 17-year-old in the Redhill General Hospital, and after a break continued until ending her career at the brand new East Surrey Hospital. This is an extract from a conversation with her brother, Tony Reason, where she describes her early days as a trainee nurse.
At time to time, we had to do night duty, and very often we were extremely tired when we got off duty in the morning, but we were not allowed to go to bed because there would be a lecture at midday. Yeah. Now, you imagine you'd been up all night and you had to wait till midday for these lectures. Sometimes we went down to the sewage farm to see how sewage was treated. We'd been to milking sheds to see how milk was pasteurized. All sorts of silly things like that. It was a strict regime. We were not allowed to have visitors in our rooms, and certainly no boyfriends or anything like that. We had to account to the home sister. She was like a mother superior to us, but it was a very good training, strict but very, very good. We didn't go to college, but we learnt on the job. We had to have our breakfast, then go straight into the ward. We had to sweep the ward. We had to pull all the beds out to the middle, one side, and then a lady would come round and put tea leaves, and then we had to sweep right the way down to the door, and she would pick it up. And then we had to damp dust. Oh, that was all part of our job. Damp dusting, all the lockers, back of beds. We had to clean the wheels and of the locker and the beds. And all the end of the bed, the wheels were all turned to face the door. And before the consultant came round, the patients had to be washed, the beds made, and the counterpane put on, corners done perfectly, so that, and the patients had to be sitting to attention, yes, before the consultant came round, yes. Oh, everything was very, also in the hospital grounds, there was a block over as you come in on the right, a long block, and that's where they used to keep the patients with TB. And they had to have their doors open for the common day and night. And even in winter, when there was snow on the ground, they still had open sliding doors for the elements to come in and keep them cold. And so some of them had 7 blankets. Yes.
This is a photograph of the members of the nurse training group I belong to, with a staff nurse in a black belt. On the far left is Doris Joyce holding her Nurse of the Year award. Third left is Barbara Savory, and yes, we did have a doctor suite. And on the far right is me. We are celebrating passing our final exams at Redhill General Hospital. Hurrah! We are now state registered nurses, a passport to all sorts of opportunities. The second photograph is the same occasion with other nurses celebrating their success. If you look closely, you will see behind us a walkway, and it is along this walkway, open to the elements, that we would fetch patients back from the operating theatres. Senior student nurses would be assigned this job, and we would immediately want to know which theatre porter we would be working with. In response to a call from theatre, we went to bring the semi-conscious patient back to the ward. Patients would always have airways in situ and sometimes drips and drains. If it was raining, they would have some sort of weatherproofing cover to keep them dry. Accompanied by a theatre porter, we would make this hazardous journey back to the ward. To get to some wards, we had to use a lift. You can now imagine how important the porter was. Some were young, flirtatious, and funny, and always helpful and reassuring. Those were the ones I preferred. They all knew this was a big responsibility for a young nurse, but they were old hands, and consequently, we gained experience and confidence regarding this strange journey. Lovely memories, but I'm glad these days patients stay indoors after their operations.
Hello, I'm Sheila Swanson. I worked at Redhill General Hospital, and I worked there beginning in 1960, working in the Pathology Lab. It was a very busy lab, and we had specimens coming to us from all over the place, the hospital, and of course, GPs and local people. And one of the ways that we've got our specimens was via the bus, which was a very rural sort of feeling. The bus each bus driver had a key which would open a blue box that was in the bus shelter outside the hospital. And so he would get off the bus and put the specimens in the box, and someone from the laboratory would go and collect them. We also had a van which went from Crawley, where there was a hospital, but it was only a cottage hospital. There was no large hospital there in those days. The van would go via Smallfield Hospital and come back to the lab in Redhill. One day we had some specimens being delivered, and the lady who was the assistant and sat beside the driver brought a large parcel which we put on the bench in the laboratory. And she said, "That's really heavy and it's too big to go in our box in the back of the van, so I've been carrying it on my lap all the way." Someone looked at the label on the specimen. It said, "Left leg amputated on," with the patient's name, and the lady promptly fainted. So we not only had a left leg, we had a patient.
In September 1972, when my eldest daughter was born, in those days you stayed in for 7 days, even 10 days, and the babies were removed at night so you got a good night's rest, and also when you had your afternoon nap. In charge of the ward was Sister Burford, who stood no nonsense. No wearing of knickers, as it would prevent your stitches from healing, although most of us did try to wear them until we were found out. She was also a great believer in drinking Guinness or Mackerson to help your milk for breastfeeding. My husband would bring in Guinness and then promptly drink it himself. Sister made us all get out of bed and sit at the table in the middle of the ward for all our meals, except for those who'd had caesareans. In spite of her brisk, no-nonsense attitude, she had a kind heart. We also had lovely ladies who were auxiliaries to help us with breastfeeding. And because most of them were mothers themselves, they were very understanding. The maternity ward had a window at the end that looked out over the common, and at the end of September, beginning of October that year, the leaves had already turned lovely colours and they were bathed in sunshine.
In 1979, when I became pregnant, I joined the National Childbirth Trust, who provided antenatal classes. So when I duly arrived at the Redhill General Maternity Unit, I had firm ideas about the birth and care of my new baby. I explained to the nurses that I wanted to breastfeed on demand. So when my baby cried, I wanted them to bring her to me. All the nurses were kind and friendly, but they had to follow the procedures of the time. It's rather wonderful that natural instinct is strong at birth, and at least for a short time afterwards. I could tell when my daughter was crying from all the other babies kept away from their mothers in a separate room. And it was stressful to have to keep asking the nurses who came on to each shift to let me have my baby near me so that I could feed her. At one point, I was told that I had to wait because the midwife who was giving instruction on feeding had not seen me yet. Later, I became active in the NCT and finally became chairperson of the East Surrey branch. We have breastfeeding counsellors and, of course, the popular antenatal classes. There were regular coffee mornings, sales of baby clothes and equipment, and there was always cake for sale. Some wags suggested we should be renamed the National Cake Trust. I suspect today's NCT hasn't changed from that perspective. In the early 90s, I went to work in the Health Promotion Unit, situated at the west end of the new East Surrey Hospital. It was a fun and creative place to work with health promotion advisors who were employed to run various health information programs. Stopping smoking, losing weight, healthy living, exercise, and information about the new disease spreading through the hetero and homo populations, AIDS. One autumn, we invited the Durex representative to come over to the unit as we wanted some posters for a sexual health display. We got more than posters. He left us with a box of all kinds and shapes of condoms and a very large quantity of key rings. Each of the latter had a small plastic box attached with a condom inside it. We did a roaring trade in selling them at Christmas presents to raise funds for the hospital. One doctor bought 20.
Redhill General Hospital was the nearest suitable emergency facility to the rapidly expanding Gatwick Airport and adjacent motorways. And by 1975, doubt was being expressed in Parliament about the hospital's ability to cope with a major accident. A huge new hospital building complex was commissioned to be built south of Redhill and was formally opened by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1984. Initially known as the New East Surrey Hospital, it also replaced Smallfield Hospital, which had closed in 1983. And by 1991, continuing development allowed the final closure of Redhill General Hospital, the site being redeveloped for housing. It so happened that at that time, in 1989, I was working at Reigate Priory when I collapsed at school and was rushed to hospital by ambulance, suffering from severe abdominal pains. It was a shiny new hospital. I was very impressed, but I woke up in a dark, dingy ward. I was in the old hospital just before its final demolition. Now finally named East Surrey Hospital, it is the major acute hospital for East Surrey and North West Sussex, whilst providing a wide range of services to the local community. In 2017, a £4 million extension was built as a cancer diagnosis and treatment centre, aided by a £2 million donation from the Macmillan Cancer Support Charity.
So today, from its small origins in Albert Road North, East Surrey Hospital, now part of the Surrey and Sussex Healthcare NHS Trust, has steadily expanded to 690 beds and is a major trauma and postgraduate training hospital with a huge catchment area, as well as being responsible for possible incidents at Gatwick Airport. Like most NHS hospitals, it has suffered from a shortage of staff and over-reorganisation and interference by successive governments, but retains an excellent reputation. In 2018, it was officially graded as outstanding, one of only 9 UK hospitals so graded. Its performance during this seemingly endless coronavirus outbreak is exemplary. The NHS is often referred to as the best health service in the world, but many countries make the same claim. It is certainly true that it is one of which we can be truly proud.